The skyline of Moscow burns once more. The heart of Russia trembles as Ukrainian drones pierce through its most guarded airspace. Flames light up billion-dollar skyscrapers. Symbols of Russian power now turn to ash and smoke. Tonight the world watches in disbelief. The war has crossed yet another line, and the message from Kyiv is loud and clear. Nowhere is untouchable. In the dark silence before dawn, Moscow was jolted awake by a thunderous series of explosions that tore through its skyline. What began as a calm, unsuspecting night quickly turned into chaos as multiple Ukrainian drones streaked across the sky, targeting the beating heart of Russia's capital. The attack was swift, surgical, and devastatingly symbolic. In mere moments, the glass and steel towers of Moscow City, once gleaming emblems of wealth, power, and national pride, were engulfed in flames. Billions of dollars worth of infrastructure was reduced to shattered debris and smoldering ruins. Witnesses reported seeing fireballs erupt from the sides of skyscrapers, their reflections dancing across the Moscow River, turning the water's surface into a mirror of destruction. The once pristine skyline was now scarred by fire, smoke, and panic. Emergency sirens wailed across the city as firefighters and rescue teams rushed toward the inferno. The streets were flooded with flashing lights and the chaos of evacuation. Civilians, still half asleep, emerged from their buildings to see flames devouring the towers that symbolized Russia's economic heart. Social media flooded with videos of the burning skyscrapers, images of orange fire plumes against the night sky, drones streaking through the air, and glass cascading from the heights like a deadly rain. Within minutes, the attack had become a global sensation, dominating headlines and igniting debates across international channels. Russia's most secure and monitored airspace had been violated again, not by a military invasion but by small, intelligent machines guided by determination and precision. For Russia, the psychological blow was as severe as the physical damage. Moscow City was never just an urban district. It was a statement to the world, a glittering showcase of modern Russia's ambition and resilience. The towers represented control, wealth, and the illusion that the war was far from home. But that illusion was shattered in the blaze. The fact that Ukrainian drones could penetrate the very airspace surrounding the Kremlin struck at the core of Russian security confidence. Questions rippled through the Russian public and defense circles. How could this happen again? Where were the defenses that boasted of shooting down incoming threats? Why were billion-dollar buildings left unprotected against relatively inexpensive drones? These questions carried weight, because each drone cost only a fraction of the luxury towers they destroyed. The symbolism of the strike could not be ignored. Ukraine had chosen its target with deliberate precision, not a military base, not a remote airfield, but a location that embodied Russia's urban prosperity and leadership. By setting Moscow's skyline ablaze, Ukraine had turned the symbols of power into reminders of vulnerability. The attack wasn't just about destruction, it was about message and momentum. Every explosion said what words could not. Russia's war was no longer contained to the borders of Ukraine, it had come home. The streets of Moscow, once untouched by the consequences of the invasion, were now witnessing the price of aggression. As daylight broke, smoke still billowed from the blackened skeletons of the skyscrapers. The acrid smell of burning metal hung in the air, mingling with a silence that felt heavier than the rubble itself. Russian state media downplayed the incident, calling it a minor drone interception, but the evidence was undeniable. Satellite imagery showed scorched rooftops, shattered glass facades, and emergency crews struggling to contain the aftermath. For Ukrainians, the strike served as both revenge and warning. It symbolized the evolution of a nation that refused to be broken, using technology, intelligence, and creativity to counter a vastly larger opponent. The world watched as a country under siege turned the tables, striking at the very nerve center of its enemy. In every burning window and collapsing floor of those billion-dollar towers, there was a reminder that no fortress, no government, and no propaganda could shield Russia from the consequences of its own war. The skyline of Moscow, once proud and untouchable, now stood as a monument to the new era of warfare where courage, innovation, and precision could outmatch even the most fortified empire. The latest drone strike on Moscow was more than an act of retaliation. It was a deliberate statement from Ukraine, written in fire and smoke over the Russian capital. For months, Ukraine had endured relentless missile and drone assaults from across the border, its cities plunged into darkness, its civilians living under constant threat. But this time Kyiv chose to flip the narrative, showing that distance was no longer a shield for those who launched destruction from afar. The message was unmistakable. If Russia could strike Ukrainian cities without consequence, Ukraine would demonstrate that Moscow itself was no longer beyond reach. Through the precision and persistence of its drone operations, Ukraine declared that the war was not confined to its soil. It was now a battle that could pierce straight into the heart of its aggressor. This operation symbolized more than just vengeance. It was a calculated shift in psychological warfare. Ukraine's drones are not targeting random military sites or unguarded facilities. They were striking symbols, places that embodied Russian wealth, power, and arrogance. By choosing Moscow City, Ukraine hit where it would hurt most, the image of untouchable prosperity that the Kremlin had worked so hard to project. Each tower, each fiery explosion was a message carved into the skyline: you cannot wage war abroad and remain safe at home. It was warfare translated into communication, a silent but deafening warning. In a single night, Ukraine managed to do what no speech, no sanction, no diplomatic warning could achieve. It made Russia feel the vulnerability it had long imposed on others. The brilliance of Ukraine's approach lies in its use of technology and adaptability. These drones were not state-of-the-art aircraft built in high-tech facilities. They were symbols of ingenuity and resilience, constructed from modified civilian technology and locally engineered components. They represented the growing sophistication of Ukraine's defense industry, born out of necessity and desperation. Each drone carried not just explosives but also strategy, a strategy that turned simplicity into strength. By relying on small, agile, and inexpensive systems, Ukraine exploited the gaps in Russia's enormous, expensive, and overconfident defense network. It was a classic underdog tactic: use the enemy's size and arrogance against them. The psychological ripples of this strike extended far beyond the physical damage. For Russian citizens, the illusion of security crumbled. The war that once felt distant was now burning just outside their windows. The same fear that Ukrainian families felt for months was now mirrored in Moscow's streets. Videos of residents rushing to shelters and firefighters battling flames in the financial district became a haunting reversal of roles. The attack forced Russians to confront a truth their government had long denied: their nation's actions abroad had real, tangible consequences at home. Internationally, the message resonated as well. Ukraine showed that it was not a passive victim waiting for Western aid. It was an active, evolving power capable of reshaping the battlefield. The drone strike demonstrated not just technical skill but strategic communication. It captured the world's attention, reignited debates about the limits of warfare, and exposed Russia's growing inability to defend even its most prized cities. Kyiv had turned the tables, forcing the world to see Ukraine not as the weaker side but as a force capable of redefining modern conflict through precision and determination. Behind every drone launched and every explosion recorded, there was a deeper meaning, a declaration of defiance. Ukraine's message was simple yet powerful: we will not stop, we will not surrender, and we will make you feel what we have felt. This wasn't mere retaliation, it was a transformation of strategy, from defense to deterrence. Russia's vast territory, once seen as an advantage, had become its greatest vulnerability. Every future strike would now carry an unspoken reminder that no matter how fortified, how proud, or how distant Moscow tried to remain, Ukraine had found a way to reach it. And in that realization, the balance of fear began to shift. No longer was Ukraine the hunted. With drones as its voice and precision as its weapon, Kyiv had made the aggressor listen and the world take notice. As the fires from the Moscow skyline still smoldered, the world's attention turned sharply toward the growing implications of Ukraine's escalating drone campaign. This was not just another battlefield update. It was a moment that reshaped the global understanding of modern warfare. The images of billion-dollar towers engulfed in flames traveled across every news network, sparking both outrage and fascination. Financial analysts watched oil and gas markets react instantly, with energy prices spiking and investors growing nervous about further instability. Political leaders called for restraint, but behind those diplomatic words was an unspoken acknowledgement. Ukraine had fundamentally changed the rules of the game. A nation under constant attack had found a way to strike back, and its methods were redefining how power could be challenged in the 21st century. For the first time in decades, the Russian heartland, long seen as untouchable, was experiencing the same fear and unpredictability that it had unleashed upon its neighbors. The burning towers in Moscow were not just physical damage, they represented a psychological and strategic shift that rippled across borders. Inside Russia, the government scrambled to project calm. State media rushed to minimize the scale of the attack, insisting that air defenses had neutralized most drones and that the damage was insignificant. But the cracks in that narrative were impossible to hide. Videos from ordinary citizens flooded social media showing towering flames and chaos in the streets. For many Russians, this was the first time the war had come so close, and the illusion of safety that the Kremlin had carefully maintained began to unravel. Ukraine's success in striking Moscow reverberated through diplomatic corridors across Europe and the United States. Western analysts saw it as a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, proof that a smaller, technologically adaptive nation could challenge a superpower through creativity and precision. These attacks carried a strategic logic that went beyond destruction. They were designed to shift the balance of fear. Ukraine was no longer just defending its borders. It was forcing Russia to defend its own. The Kremlin, once the hunter, was now being hunted in its own skies. Every future night in Moscow would bring with it the anxiety of another siren, another drone, another reminder that war was no longer a distant operation but a threat within. The implications extended far beyond the battlefield. Energy infrastructure, trade networks, and international supply chains all felt the tremors. The perception of Russia's control weakened, and questions began to arise among its allies. If Moscow could not protect its own capital, how could it guarantee security elsewhere? This doubt eroded the aura of strength that Vladimir Putin had spent decades building. The global audience, meanwhile, began to reassess Ukraine's position, not as a victimized state reliant on foreign aid, but as a technologically innovative military force capable of rewriting warfare dynamics. The drones that ignited Moscow's skyline were not just weapons. They were symbols of resistance, of strategy, of a nation refusing to be defined by size or fear. The strike also exposed the growing gap between traditional military power and modern tactical innovation. Russia, with its massive arsenal of missiles, tanks, and aircraft, had underestimated the influence of low-cost, high-precision drone warfare. Ukraine's ability to use small, adaptable drones to achieve such massive symbolic and economic impact demonstrated a future where agility outweighs brute force. It was a message to the world's militaries: wars will no longer be won merely by who has the most firepower, but by who can outthink and outmaneuver their opponent in the digital and aerial arenas. For the Russian leadership, this event was a nightmare scenario. The burning towers were not just structures, they were symbols of vulnerability, of exposure, of lost control. The Kremlin faced mounting pressure from within as its citizens demanded answers. The government's usual tools of censorship and denial could not extinguish the visible evidence of failure. For Ukraine, however, the strike was a defining victory, not because of the scale of destruction, but because of the fear it generated in the enemy's heart. The balance of psychological power had shifted. As the world continues to watch this evolving conflict, one fact stands out. Ukraine's drone strike on Moscow marked more than a military escalation. It marked a turning point in global warfare. The attack demonstrated that even the strongest empires can be shaken from within, that modern technology can turn the smallest nation into a formidable opponent. It sent an unshakable message to the Kremlin and the world alike. The era of untouchable powers is over. What burns in Moscow is not just steel and glass, it is the myth of invincibility itself. As smoke still rises from Moscow's skyline, one thing is certain: the war has entered a new phase. Ukraine has proven that even the mightiest fortress can be reached, that every symbol of oppression can burn. This isn't just about drones or towers, it's about a message written in fire across the Russian capital. The question now isn't if more strikes will come, it's when. And as the world holds its breath, Moscow is learning the cost of waging war against a nation that refuses to bow.